I know we've done a lot of stuff. You talked obviously about you and your father's involvement in the anti-abortion crusade. We kind of
Yeah,
covered that in a couple episodes, and I talked about your book, Crazy for God, which was fascinating. But what I'm doing is I'm doing a lot of research on Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority.
yeah,
And what I'm seeing is a through line to a lot of the stuff that he and other people like him started back in the 70s and 80s with the evangelical Trump support. I know that's something
yeah.
you've talked a lot about, but you were there. I mean, you met Falwell Sr., you met Pat Robertson, and all these other kind of big heavy hitters. Maybe we can go back and kind of talk about some of the roots of how all that came about, in
Yeah.
addition to obviously the anti-abortion piece.
Yeah, I mean, Met doesn't even cover it. With
Mm.
Falwell, I preached from his pulpit and
Hmm.
spoke to his whole student assembly with his faculty at the school.
Right.
And by the way, they keep recordings of all those things, all their famous guest preachers. And not that I was famous, but you know what I'm saying.
Hmm.
All evidence of my having been there has been scrubbed off all their sites. You can't.
Really?
No, yeah. To the point where I got an email from a guy about 3 years ago saying, I have a very rare thing. I said, what's that? And he said, I've still got a cassette tape that I recorded from the audience of you talking to the college because they have scrubbed it from their archive. You can't find my talks in their library. Because I'm now persona non grata. But the other reason they scrubbed it is because even back in the day when I went there, I had just written a book as an evangelical writer called Addicted to Mediocrity that was about Christians in the arts and how trying to make them all gospel witnessing tools was a waste, and that Bach and Rembrandt and all these other artists in the Northern Reformation countries that my dad talked about never did that. It wasn't about salvation, it was about good art. So even back then, if you looked at the seeds of my writing, and another book called Sham Pearls for Real Swine, you would see that the through line from my rebellion began by trying to reform the very things within the evangelical community that
Hmm.
made me finally leave. This actually relates to your question. So when
Right.
I went in to speak to Jerry Falwell's campus at that time, now the Falwell, well, it's not Falwell anymore, they kicked him out, but
That's true.
the Liberty Baptist, as it was known there, now it's just Liberty University, had, I think, 7,500 students when I went there. Now it's like 75,000.
Oh,
But
it's
in any
huge.
case, my talk was incredibly well received by the students, to the chagrin of both Falwell and the professors, who got a lot of questions they didn't want.
Ah.
Like, why are we trying to make witnessing tools when art has value in itself? Why is everything about propagandizing the quote lost? How about the intrinsic value of life itself? I was bringing these questions up in an infant form that
Hmm.
became, in a way, my road out on aesthetic basis from the evangelical community. So even back in the day when I was with Falwell, some of my interface with that group was contentious already. The other area it was contentious is when Falwell would make very bigoted anti-gay
Hmm.
remarks,
Yeah.
some of which I put in my book, Crazy for God, talking about being backstage with him at the church and him saying if he had a dog that did what he used an expletive about gays. He didn't call
Mm.
them gays or homosexuals, a bad word. He said, if they did what these blank do, I would shoot them.
Hmm.
So in essence, the first thing I'd like to say, and this is not in any order of importance, but that my exposure to Jerry Falwell in particular, and Pat Robertson after that, was the beginning of my getting out of the movement, because they were such vile creatures, and they were so awful to be around. Pat Robertson as well. Horribly hypocritical. One thing on front of the camera in the pulpit, real bigot in
Hmm.
Falwell's case behind, so dishonest in so many ways that even while I was trying to suck up to him, to be honest, because that gave me a big platform,
Oh yeah, they were big names.
okay, big names, I was disgusted with them, and then started being really disgusted with myself for
Hmm.
having anything to do with these guys. And back then could justify it by saying, well, we're here arguing the case for the unborn. We're trying to get this project launched. Nobody wants to know about abortion because they see it as a Catholic issue. This is in the early days. And we're going to have to convince these evangelicals to become pro-lifers instead of pro-choice. Because as I've said before on your program, what most people don't know on the left or right is that most of the evangelical leadership, like Dr. Billy Graham, Dr. Criswell, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, were not just ambivalent on abortion. They were pro-choice when Roe v. Wade came along. And so was the editorial board of Christianity Today. So first thing to say about my contact with Falwell and Robertson in particular was that at the beginning, we were trying to talk them into a, quote, pro-life position, and they were either ambivalent or, in the case of Criswell and Graham, pro-choice. And then when it came to Falwell, he was such an unsavory character, and I mean literally just an oily kind of con artist, and it was so self-evident working with him and then getting to know the people around him. For instance, Cal Thomas at that time helped him, who was the president of the Moral Majority under Falwell, who left the Moral Majority because of the dishonesty of Falwell's fundraising methods. Then Cal went on and became a commentator on Fox News in the early days and so on. This whole group of people were my, as it were, the beginning of me getting out on two levels. One, the aesthetic level we're talking about, and secondly, the fact that in comparison to the humble beginnings of my own Christian life within the evangelical faith work of L'Abri Fellowship that my parents started, where, as I mentioned before, Dad's working on the side of his bed with no secretary, we don't own a car, we meet once a week, and the rest is all vegetable casseroles with rice and beans because there's no budget. You know, that was my Christian, quote, growing up childhood. This is what mission work looks like. And then fast forward into my early 20s, and Jerry Falwell's lending me his jet to fly around the country to raise money for our joint projects that we're doing in terms of a seminar tour. That's kind of a meandering overall look at my first impressions and involvement. But I'd just say again, my talk I gave to his students and his faculty caused such waves down there that they were disappearing it before I even quit and got out. Just the idea of standing up and saying fundamentalism is wrong. Life is not all about witnessing for Jesus, but for doing things for their own sake, whether it's falling in love and getting married or art or any of these other things. We're not propagandists for Jesus.